this is Izzy from Minerva. In today's video we're going to do a fantastic waistband technique, which is a sheared waistband. This is an incredibly versatile technique. You can add it to the tops of trousers, you can add it to skirts and dresses just to define and fit the garment really nicely against your body. And because it's elasticated, it just sort of shrinks and fits with your body shape. So it's a really nice, easy way of getting a garment to fit your body really beautifully. As always with this tutorial, there are a standard list of things that you're going to need to join along with me today. And we've also added sheared elastic thread, which you can buy on our website and will be tagged below the video. It looks something like this. In this tutorial, I'm going to be using my skirt block, which is my standard skirt block, my fitted one, but you can apply this waistband principle to your trouser block or any other skirts that you've designed. I've purposely designed this tutorial to show a separate waistband casing so that you can then attach that waistband onto any other shape of skirt or trouser that you want. So it may be, although we're showing a straight skirt today, it may be that you actually want to add a gathered aspect to your sheared waistband so you've got a really nice full shape. Or it may be that you want to do the slash and spread method or an A-line skirt that you then want to attach onto this waistband. So as always, it's completely up to you to how you piece together all the different bits of this particular series. Okay, so let's get straight into it. So to start off with, trace over your own skirt block or trouser block, whichever one you're using, and then we're going to start editing that and tracing over it to create our new pattern pieces. For the purpose of this video, I've just printed mine off and they're here before me now. So we'll start off with our skirt back pattern piece. Now this skirt is designed to sit on the natural waist, and we will continue to do that with our pattern waistband. However, you may well want to drop your waistband 5 centimeters so that it sits along your low waist. Just whatever is more comfortable for you, work with that because this is your pattern and your shapes that you're creating. I want to create a nice waistband that's going to sit across the top of this skirt. So in order to do that, I'm just going to measure off a point that is 7 centimeters from the top of the waistband at that point there along the centre back. I'm then going to square that off. Now I've laid my skirt back and my skirt front out on the table together here, so I can literally just continue that line up to my skirt front. I'm going to start to draw my sheared waistband aspect up here separately. So let's do that together now. Extend your centre back line up. The next thing to do is to measure the distance of your waistband so that you know that for sure. And don't forget just to walk it off using your tape measure nice and accurately. Leaving a gap where the darts are. Don't include the darts in your calculation. Just make a little note of that. Yours will be different to mine obviously at this point. Next, continue the side seam from the hip upwards, that's this straight line here, and continue that up. Do the same for the centre front. Next, draw a nice, neat, perpendicular line across these waistband pieces. Now, we know that our waistband depth at this point is going to be 7 centimeters across both the front and the back, which is great. So our waistband depth needs to be at 7 centimeters deep. However, for the purpose of this demonstration, what we're going to show you is actually how to make it really nice and neat, and we're going to fold the waistband back on itself. So we're going to double the width of our waistband. So for me, 7 times 2 is 14. So I'm just going to mark on a line that runs parallel with the one that we've just drawn at 14 centimeters, which is double the width of the waistband. It may well be that you find it helpful just to mark a centre line down this piece so that you can see exactly where your fold line is going to be. Great, so we've got our back waistband and our front waistband. Now the reason we've taken this line up and got our dimension across here to be the dimension of the hip line is simply so that we can pull the skirt on over our hips straight up, and the sheared bit of the waistband is going to stretch out over our hips, and then it's going to shrink to fit our waistband size that we've got here. Now, as a rule of thumb with shearing, you usually multiply the circumference of the area you're trying to fit 0.2 by 1.4. That's usually the amount of stretch that shearing will give you. Now, you might just want to double check that that's achieving at least, around about that, or maybe just a bit less to get a tighter fit. But if you've ever done shearing before, you will know that shearing is very sort of dependent on the type of fabric you use. The lighter the type of fabric, the more stretch it will effectively give you. The elastic is going to take out more volume out of the fabric if it's lighter. And also the tension that you use on your machine and the type of elastic you use, again, will all affect the amount of pull and shape that that elastic gives you. However, as an absolute minimum, you need to make sure that your skirt is going to pull up over the widest part of your trousers or your skirt, which for me is the hip line. For you, it might be somewhere a little bit higher on your garment, but it needs to be able to pull up over the widest part of your body. Great. At this point now, we can simply just cut off our waistband from our skirt, because we're just removing that volume completely, and then just extend that line of the skirt to your new side seam, which is this bit here. Now, if you look at ready-to-wear garments that have a sheared feature in them, you'll almost always find that the very top of the sheared feature has some form of thin elastic or wider elastic. And what that does is it actually just sort of gives the garment a bit more structure at the top, and it also holds, especially if you've got quite a big skirt or quite a big dress or lots of volume of fabric, it just gives you a firmer finish to the top of the garment and just holds it in place a little bit better. So this demo, for the purpose of this demo, I will actually show you how to do that as well. So now what we're going to do is draft out the length of elastic that we're going to need right at the top of our skirt. So calculate the length of your top of your waistband. For me, on the skirt back, it's 18.3. And likewise, calculate the length of your waistband for your skirt front, avoiding the darts and taking that volume out. So this bit plus that bit. And then add those two lengths together. Multiply that by 2 to get the full circumference of your waist. And then I want you to times that by 0.8 and then add 3 centimetres. So the elastic that I want to include at the top of my skirt is going to be 61.5 centimetres long. Now, the elastic that I've chosen to use for this is about 1 centimetre wide. This is it here. Now, the calculation that we've done is based on just maths, but obviously you've got your own body that you can wrap your elastic around. So it may well be that you actually want to just wrap the elastic that you've used around your waistband and just sort of work out what is a comfortable length that I want, rather than using the maths for pattern drafting, because this is obviously, for you. And every piece of elastic is different in terms of the amount of stretch that it will give you and how comfortable it feels against your skin. So this is one way of getting an estimate, but actually you may as well just wrap it around your body and cut the elastic length that you need. Don't forget to add your 1.5 centimetres to either end of the elastic so that you can sew it in place together to create a nice big loop. Now, you may well just want to mark that out. Great, now we've got that all sorted, let's get our tracing paper and trace over our pattern pieces, adding our seam allowances and annotation as required. Great, we'll start at the top with our elastic length guide. So our elastic length was, for me it's 58.5, and that is the length that needs to fit around the circumference of our waist. However, we need to allow for a seam allowance so that the elastic can fold back on itself and be attached in one place. So we're going to add 3 centimetres to the length of our elastic, and that just allows 1.5 centimetres at one end and 1.5 centimetres at the other end. Great, we're going to move on to our back waistband and front waistband. And we're just going to add our 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the top of both of these. And the same at the bottom. At the centre front and centre back, we're not going to allow any seam allowance, simply because we're going to place that on the fold. And then add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowances to your side seams. At this point, I would just add a little notch at the fold line and then annotate your pattern pieces with your standard annotation. Place on fold. Grain line. Front waistband, cut 1 on fold. Got that wrong, that's the back waistband. This is our front waistband. Cut one, unfold. Beautiful. And then we're just going to repeat the same for the skirt. Don't forget that we've removed the waistband width off the top of the skirt. So we're just going to trace around the main body of the skirt here. I'm just going to shorten the skirt by 10 centimetres at the hemline. Add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the top of the pattern piece and likewise to the side seam, which is now a nice long straight line because we want the width of our skirt at the top to tie in with our waistband. Repeat that process for the skirt back and then annotate your pattern pieces as required. Place unfold, grain line, add your hip notch as a reference and skirt back, cut one, unfold. Repeat for your skirt front. Brilliant, so we've drafted out our skirt pattern pieces for our sheared waistband. Off you go and cut that out of your fabric of your choice. Don't forget that we'd recommend for sheared features that you use a lightweight fabric. So off we go. Fantastic, so we've cut out all of our pattern pieces. The first thing that I'm going to ask us to do is just to sew the skirt together. So we're going to lay the front over the back with the right sides together and just align the side seam. You've got your hip notch as a nice reference at this point and just pin this in place. Repeat the same process of just pinning down the side seam for the other side of the skirt. Now I'm going to sew the garment, as always, with contrasting thread. You do whatever you need to do though. We're doing this so you can see it in the video above nicely. So we're going to sew these side seams now using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. At this point you can finish those seams however you want to. You can either overlock them, you could pinking shear them, you could zigzag stitch the raw edges, just hold them in place so it stops them from fraying. I won't be doing that because this is just a technical exercise, but if you're doing your final garment at home, don't forget to finish your seams. And then either press the seams open if you finish them separately, or if you finish them together using an overlocker, just press them towards the back. Okay, let's look at the waistband now. So we've got our back and our front. So with our back, right side facing up and the front right side facing down on top of it, I just want us to align one of the side seams and we're going to sew that together. So pin that in place, making sure you're lining up your notch in the middle. Now these side seams are going to be encased into the waistband, which will be sheared, so you're not actually going to see them. What you might find it helpful to do is just trim them down slightly, just to reduce any bulk from the garment, and then just go and press those side seams open. Now the next thing I'd recommend us doing with this waistband piece is actually folding it in half width-wise like this, and just ironing that in place so that we've got a nice reference for where the top of the waistband is across the entire length of the waistband. So just go away and press that in place so you've got a nice sharp edge at the top. Great. Okay, so our elastic is going to sit right at the top of the skirt, and that's just acting sort of a strengthening aspect to the shearing to make sure the skirt actually stays on when we pull it up, because shearing can be a little bit temperamental, can't it? So just mark off the width of your elastic from the top of that folded edge, just on both sides, just so that you know the width of it. Mine is 1 centimetre at least. Yeah, it's 1.5 actually almost. So what I'm trying to do now is to mark on where I want my first line of sheared stitches. I want the elastic, this big piece of elastic, just to sit really comfortably at the top here. So I'm going to offset my first line 2 centimetres from this folded edge. So just using my washable pen, I'm now going to flip that onto the right side. And I'm just going to mark a line using my washable pen on the right side of the fabric at 2 centimetre offset from that folded edge. And just do that to both sides of the fold. So what this does is it now gives us our 2 lines of stitching, of sheared stitching on where they want to be. Now we should be able to use our guide on our foot to ascertain exactly the sort of offset distance that we want the next line to be. Our shearing lines are going to be at 1.5 centimetre distance from each other. It may be that you want to mark on all your lines of shearing just so you get it absolutely perfect, or you may be confident enough just to use the foot on your sewing machine as a guide. Brilliant, so we've marked on our shearing lines onto our fabric, or at least the first 2 ones. And now what we want to do is we want to be able to use and grab our sheared elastic string, and this is going to go into the bobbin of our sewing machine, and then we'll use standard thread on the top. If you want more support in terms of how to shear and using that technique, please do have a look at some of our other YouTube tutorials. This is just a pattern drafting one, so we're going to show you the effects of shearing. But fundamentally, you want to put this into your bobbin, and you want to hand attach it into your bobbin rather than use your sewing machine. Okay, so we're now going to grab our elasticated shearing thread, and we're going to wind our bobbin up by hand. You want a reasonable amount of tension, but you don't want to pull it so it's completely taut. You just want to start winding it up with a reasonable amount of tension as you wind. We'll just do this by hand. Gives you a little bit more control. Again, I'm going to be using contrasting thread for my shearing so that you can see it really clearly in the video. However, you may well want to use matching shearing. Okay, so we're then going to just pop our bobbin into the machine, and we're going to thread it in the normal way. Now make sure if you've got any bits that are sticking out like that, that you've cut them off. And we're just going to thread the bobbin in the usual manner. Now, the critical point of this is to make sure that your bobbin takes exactly in the same way as your normal thread would take in your machine. That's a really common problem with shearing. The next thing you also want to do is to change the tension on your machine so it's much higher. So usually my machine is set to a tension of about 4. I'm going to increase that to 7 and give that a go. And then your stitch length needs to be long as well. So remember, high tension and long stitch. Standard stitch length is about 2.5. I'm going to move mine up to 4. Now, throughout the shearing process, you need to experiment both with your fabric, tension on the elastic, tension on the machine, and also your stitch length. There are loads of different things that work together to create really successful shearing. So don't be disheartened if you've got to give it a go and sort of keep trying a few times to work out what works well for your machine and for your fabric. I'm now just going to follow the lines that I've already drawn on my calico fabric, and I'm just going to sew a straight stitch right from the edge all the way along. We're not going to go backwards and forwards at the beginning because the sheared elastic doesn't like that. When you get to the end, the raw edge, lift up your foot, and I would just recommend pivoting along. Just pivot the fabric and go back again so that you're hitting your next nice line. Now don't worry too much if the first line isn't too gathered yet. You can see it's creating a nice straight line at the back, and we can also iron this to increase the elasticity. So continue sewing all the way along your lines in the same manner. You'll probably find that you need to replace your elastic bobbin quite a few times. We're going to sew all the way along all those lines. Okay, so at this point we've run out of our elastic down at the bottom at this end down here. So I'm just going to pull out the last couple of layers of threads. So I'm just going to pull the last few layers of threads out, and then I'm going to grab the thread from the other side, the standard thread, and I'm just going to pull it through to the other side and tie it off in a knot just to keep it all nice and secure so it doesn't unravel at a later date. So pull that through and just tie that tiny bit of elastic together with your thread. Brilliant, so let's start off where we ended up. We'll just continue that line of stitching. Once again, just grab your thread from one side and a needle and just pull it through to the other side, and then we'll just tie a knot on the inside. Now there will be another point where where we had to restart the bobbin thread, which is down here at this point here. So you're going to want to tidy that end up as well by pulling it through to the other side of the fabric and tying off the elastic at that point. Perfect. So we've got some really nice sheared features there for our waistband. And what we're going to do now is just continue to prep it. Yours might be much more stretchy than mine because this calico is actually quite a thick fabric, so the thinner the fabric, the more kind of bunched up it will be. Next, we're going to attach the elastic to one side of the waistband. So at this point up here where you've got the notch, you want to just pin or clip the elastic to that line there. Pin the elastic to one side of the fold that you've done in the middle. And grab the elastic and pin the middle to the seam here. Now you could do some complicated maths and work out the exact kind of distance between all of that if you wanted to. And pin the other side to the other seam allowance over here. Okay, now in between these two pins we're going to stretch it out. And just pin it in place at a few locations, so when we're sewing it, it's going to stretch evenly. Okay, so we've pinned that in place, so when we stretch it out, it's stretching out nice and evenly. What we're going to do now is we're just going to sew that in place using the same stitch length as we used for the shearing, which for me was actually, I ended up doing 5mm stitch length for that. So we're going to sew in a straight line right down the middle of the elastic so that we're just going to hold the elastic in place. So what we want to do now is to sew with right sides together. We want to then sew the side seam up now that we've done all the elastic prep work. So pin that together, making sure that you're lining the notches and the ends really nicely. And then sew using your standard 1.5cm seam allowance. At this point, you can then grab your skirt. I then want us basically just to pin the waistband to the skirt. So with right sides together, we're inserting the waistband over the skirt, and we're just going to pin it in place, matching up our side seams to start off with, and then stretching out the fabric to be evenly distributed in between. Now what we do want to make sure is that our elastic is closer to this end up here, because we're going to be folding that down and it's going to sit at the back of the skirt, on the inside of the skirt. Now these two pieces should line up absolutely perfectly because they are the same circumference on my pattern drafting, but if you've done a gathered skirt to attach onto this sheared waistband, obviously you need to adapt your gathers to match in to be the same length as your waistband. And just sew that seam using a 1.5cm seam allowance. Okay, so we've pressed that seam up, and what we're going to do now at the raw edge up here is we're just going to finish that using an overlocker. And the reason I'm going to do that is just to give it to stop the raw edge from fraying. You could, if you wanted to, fold it down by 1.5 and then stitch in the ditch all the way around. That would be fine. Or you could add bias binding to the edge of this as well if you wanted to finish it nicely that way. Lots of different ways. We're going to use the overlocker. Lovely, so that's finished that really nicely there with a nice neat overlocked edge at that point. Next we're just going to turn our waistband over, turn it over at the fold and then just pin it in place in a few places on the inside, specifically along the seams to make sure that's all lining up really nicely. And then you probably also just want to pin it in a few places at midpoints along. Great, so now we've pinned it all on the outside and we can see that it's stretching out really nicely to accommodate all that elastic. We're just going to flip it through to the right side of the garment, turn it right sides out. And then we're going to do what we normally do, which is we will be stitching in the ditch between the waistband and the skirt. So think about which way it's going to go through the machine and then just pop a few pins in the seam allowance, checking that your pins are holding on to the waistband as well as to the skirt piece, and it's also hiding the seam allowance on the inside. Don't forget to take out the pins on the inside as you go, so you don't want to be stitching over those later. Great, okay, so we've added our pins into the seam allowance here, and if I flip that over, you can see that the pins are just catching nicely to this bit which we've folded over, so looking really nice and neat on the inside now. So let's just sew with the right side facing up. We're going to stitch in the ditch all the way along. Don't forget that this is stitching the ditch. It's a stitch that we're trying to hide within the seam allowance, within the fold of the seam, I should say, but it may be seen, so it's a top stitch length, which is about 1.6 mil long rather than your standard 2.5. Now those of you who know how to do a lot of shearing will be wondering why we've left this final step to the end, and the reason is simply that I don't want to do this step until the end because it makes it harder to sew. So we've not used the iron at all yet on our shearing, but what you may notice is that the shearing maybe on yours isn't quite as tight as you'd like it to be. On mine it could be a bit tighter, but to be honest I think it's looking pretty good. But there's one really nice easy technique that we can do, which is to steam our shearing. So let's give that a go. You want to put your iron so it's on high steam factor. And then you just want to gently sort of place it over and just steam it off a little bit. You can see that's already got a bit tighter there. Just keep looking at that. You can almost see it shrinking actually as I'm placing the iron over it. I'm just hovering it over, I'm not pressing it down. And you can see, even as I turn it over, how much more gathered that bit is compared to that bit. So we'll do the other side now. You may want to repeat that process on the inside. For me, to be honest, that's looking really nice now. So that has seriously shrunk that down to size, hasn't it? So when you put that on, that's just going to gather really nicely. So here we have our sheared waistband. It's all complete and it's looking great. I absolutely love this technique, and I do think that having the elastic at the top, that extra bit of elastic, just really helps hold the skirt up really nicely. Just gives it that nice finishing touch. You can imagine if the shearing was lower or if there was less of it, that also would have quite a big impact on how the shearing looks, wouldn't it? So worth considering as you think about how you're going to use this design feature in your pattern drafting. So that's it, we have done our sheared skirt. Well done. I hope you found that really helpful and easy to follow. It's a brilliant technique. I absolutely love shearing. I think it's a fantastic little technique to add to any point in a garment. It just adds a little bit of drama, a little bit of fitting, and it looks really cool. I've seen a lot of these sheared waistbands currently in the shops as well. And what I really like about the one that I've just shown you today is the fact that the inside looks as nice as the outside for the sheared effect. With the domestic sewing machines, sometimes the elastic at the bottom can sometimes look a little bit messy, which is why I like to encase it really nicely in that manner that I've shown you. It probably would be a lot quicker if you didn't, but I think that's a really nice way of doing it. I hope you've enjoyed that. We always love to see what you're doing and what experiments you're doing with your pattern drafting skills. So please do create an account on our Minerva website and we will be following and seeing all the lovely things that you're doing. Please do post them and do tag us. Thank you for joining me today. It's been great fun looking at this shearing technique. Please do follow our YouTube Minerva account and we look forward to welcoming you back for the next tutorial.